This session is community development analysis. So take it away, Chris.
All right. Well, thank you, Sandy, and thanks for everybody to be attending this particular session. And we'll certainly be talking a lot about housing, but also this process and what was ultimately about a year and a half worth of time, and this culmination of efforts and what ended up being this citywide assessment under the auspices of housing, and is also leading to additional efforts that are currently underway. For those of you who do not know me, my name is Chris Danley, and I am an owner of Vitruvian Planning here in Boise, and have been in the area for about 15 years, have worked all over the state of Idaho in a lot of different capacities, but as a practicing planner, most of all. Also served on the city's Planning and Zoning Commission for a few years, so kind of have also that unusual sort of background when it comes to generally city policy, planning, and governance structure and all that sort of thing. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and do our share screen here. And get started. So, okay, once again, thanks for everybody for attending this. And so we'll be getting a little bit of an overview of this whole process and all of the findings that came around with it. We'll start off a little bit about, let me back that up, why this approach, and then health and housing, and just what that means. A little bit of, again, as I mentioned, the process, the findings in particular, some of the city thematic findings, the geographic findings, and then ultimately next steps. So why this approach? Housing is a complicated issue. It's not just about 2x4s and concrete and a roof. It's about where you live. It's about our experiences, our neighborhoods, and everything that comes along with it. For many, many years in this country, we've been spending our money when it comes to general health on the wrong things. We are very good at spending money on the care that is necessary after we get sick in a number of ways, rather than the prevention of getting sick to begin with. Health is, as I mentioned, quite a complicated issue. It's not just about physical health, it's also about some other elements of health, as I'll mention momentarily and describe. But it has a lot of different inputs, including our environment that we live in around it, our behaviors, and really, what does that matter? Our behaviors are also dictated by our environment. Those two things obviously come together. If we don't have things nearby or proximate, do we participate in the types of activities that generate a good high quality of life, as an example? What this project did not want to be, and what the city did not want to be, is an exercise in a long-range model. The city did not want ultimately a document that was all about simply the generation of a bunch of numbers that in 20, 30 years was going to be some target that was never going to be accurate to begin with. The notion of models being accurate, unfortunately, in my personal perspective, is that they're often flawed. Whoever would have thought this COVID issue to begin with? Lumber prices, as we know right now, are incredibly high. We have labor issues in the housing market that are cyclical. Interest rates vary. They've been low for quite some time now, but we don't know what the history or what the future of those would be. So there's so many variables that go into what ultimately is going to generate what our needs for housing are, that it was viewed that instead we ought to look at what we have now. What are our needs, and how do we ultimately get to a much healthier place for all of the citizens of the city of Boise? And so that leads me to the graphic that's on the right, which is community impact, which is going upstream. So if any of you have worked with folks in the public health realm, you might be familiar with that term. Downstream is a poor analogy, but is sort of the idea of giving somebody a water bottle, which is what was done for years and years, and saying, hey, this water bottle, use it, this will make you healthy, one-on-one type of stuff, versus community impact, which is looking at the conditions and surroundings of where someone might live instead, and saying, all right, now how do we address those things, recognizing that there will ultimately be other impacts later down the road. As I was thinking about this presentation, it occurred to me a story real briefly that I'll share with you that I think illustrates this pretty well. Many years ago, I was in the Navy, and I had a good friend of mine. This was about the year 2000, who was really excited one day and came into our shop, and he wanted to show me something. He said, Chris, come outside. I said, okay, Otis, what's up? So he shows me, he takes out his car keys and he pushes a button. And on that button was a remote starter. And from across the parking lot, his car started. And he was really excited about that. And I asked him, Otis, I have a couple questions for you, however. How much time do you spend, driving this vehicle? And I knew when we lived in this really small town of Oak Harbor, it wasn't going to be a very long answer. And he told me about 20 to 30 minutes a day. I said, well, Otis, do you have a bed? And I knew Otis well enough to know that he did not. He was definitely a bachelor. And instead, he had an air mattress. I said, Otis, how much time do you spend sleeping on that air mattress? He said, oh, I don't know, 8 or 9 hours. I said, think about that for a minute, right? And it finally occurred to him, and as excited as he was, I kind of burst his bubble that day and made him realize that maybe he was investing in the wrong thing. And instead of improving his quality of life, and in that case sleep and so forth, by having an actual bed, he went and bought this car starter. And in a similar way, that story, I think, sort of illustrates what we're getting at with this project, which is all about improving the conditions that we spend most of our time in. Most of our day is spent at home, 8, 9, 10 hours for the most part, and in the neighborhood that we live in as well. So if we can get those neighborhoods as healthy as possible, accessible, and all of the things that go into a healthy life, then chances are our life is going to be that much better. And again, it's not just about the roof over our head. So that leads us to health and housing. We know that these are the sort of inputs that go into the health outcomes and where we live, the stability, the quality and safety, all of these things. Absolutely, affordability goes into this equation. And as I mentioned repeatedly already, the neighborhood in which we live. But all of these factors also contribute and are part of what we call the 7 dimensions of health and wellness. This is not something that my company created, but is darn sure something that we have borrowed the heck out of for the last several years. And I would encourage everybody who's watching to do the same. And it's a recognition that when it comes to health, our health is not just physical. We absolutely tend to gravitate toward physical health because it's the easiest and most discussed. However, these other elements are also what make a healthy life and environment. So if we can look through our communities through this lens, through each of these 7 dimensions, then we would likely identify the things that are the strengths and weaknesses and ultimately what is necessary to improve where we live. And last thought here, as I've kind of mentioned with the proximity, and this kind of illustrates, it starts to take on the built environment, the land use form of our cities, and this notion of mixture of environment, the everyday things that we need, right? The green and open spaces that we hope to access and need to get that environmental exposure, and on and on and on, in addition to the mixture of people. The different demographics that are represented within the city of Boise, and having that good mixture and how that might enrich our lives. So this is starting to take you on this sort of journey of what housing and health sort of looks like. So let's dive into our process. We created a process a few years ago that is pretty straightforward, but has been very helpful and informative in a number of the projects that we've used it, including this one now, and as we are also, as we speak, embarking on a similar project in Idaho Falls. We start with data, and once we collect as much data as we can identify, and you'll see that momentarily, we then use that data to give us direction on where to go next. And the where to go next is the field review. And that field review is essentially truthing for us. We spend a lot of time on almost every one of the streets within the census tracts that sort of flag, which I'll explain momentarily, to see for ourselves what's going on and take pictures and document conditions and so on. And then ultimately, we also then go in and identify folks we need to go talk to at a very local level. I don't want to speak to the superintendent of a school district. They're, with all due respect, going to talk about, generally speaking, citywide school issues and maybe test scores and funding and that sort of thing. What I want to do is talk to the principal of the elementary school that's down on the corner, because that principal is going to be very honest and raw with me and tell me much more greater detail of what's happening in that neighborhood that I need to know to then convey for the rest to the other folks in the project team, and ultimately back out to the residents who live in the city of Boise and in that neighborhood. We use and always try to use census tracts. For many years, folks have said this general statement that our zip code matters more than our genetic code. And in certain geographies, that is accurate. The city of New York has 40 buildings that have their own zip codes. Well, in the city of Boise, we only have, I think it was 3 or 4 zip codes for the entire city. So it's not as distinguishable of a geography as census tracts can be. That's illustrated by one of our zip codes, for example, includes the eastern part of Garden City, the parts of State Street and Hill Road, and up into Hidden Springs. All of those neighborhoods are within specifically one zip code. And if you know our area, you know that they are worlds apart. So census tracts, while maybe not perfect and not entirely at the neighborhood level specifically, they're much greater and closer detail to what we generally describe as our neighborhoods. Information that we started with and collected. We started to gather information that is specific to, so it's called the social determinants of health. Obviously, we begin with much of the demographic and specific housing information that we need to collect, and a lot of that is illustrated and demonstrated rather on the page in front of you. So clearly things like age, median age, life expectancy, and some of the other categories. And then you get into the housing of vacancy rate and owner cost burden and a bunch of other things. There's a lot of overlap in these specific categories. And as I show you the next couple things in a minute, you'll start to see that. Much of this information comes from the census, but not all of it. In fact, a lot of it also came from the city of Boise. One of those, as I'll show you at the very bottom of this list, is tree canopy. If you know what's recently been occurring with the city of Boise, you know that we've embarked on a pretty bold project to replant a whole bunch of trees in this city of trees. So we were fortunate to know what the tree canopy coverage is within the city and by census tract. Physical health and environmental health. Here are a couple other broader categories and the subsequent topics within some of those. And again, as I mentioned, much of this has overlap. So you can easily make an argument that heart disease rate is a demographic issue as much as it is a physical health issue if you really want. That's less important. More important are the number of categories. But as you can see, greater access to food, physical health status, obesity, acres of park space, bus stops. We tried to really capture a good amount of data in our initial process. And then finally, some of these other features here, economic health, emotional health, and intellectual health. I should also state that we collected, I think it was pretty much 50 different data points, 37 of which were used for scoring. And I'll describe how that scoring occurs now. When we looked at all of those pieces of information, what we did was cross-compared each of the census tracts with each other. So we did not compare Boise to Meridian or Eagle. We compared census tract 1 with census tract 10, for example, so that it was an apples to apples comparison as much as possible. When we did that, and we recognized that certain categories had a little more weight maybe than others, we provided a scoring mechanism, a simple 1 through 3 scoring mechanism, and then tallied up the number of points that ultimately led to this map. This map was our North Star. As you can see, Tier 1 are the census tracts that have the most points. What we're trying to have is the least amount of points. What this means to us is that we have the most problematic issues are flagging within those particular tracts. So Tier 1, 2, 3 are a sort of a ranking from top to bottom, so to speak, but grouped within these tiers that led us to the next couple of phases of our project, the on the ground piece of it, and then the interview phase. There are a few things worth pointing out here as well. These tiers do not mean that obviously every street or every person or every neighborhood in these particular tracts are having various problems or issues or anything of that sort. It does mean, however, that there are likely, generally speaking, issues that we need to identify and address moving forward. And the chances are these are the areas where we're seeing the most challenges for folks living in the city of Boise. We were able to take this information and sort of glean out a few other different approaches, as you'll see over the next couple of slides. One, a citywide finding. So these particular metrics are everybody, 100% of all residents tallied up and stating unequivocally what we have citywide, okay? So 48% of our renters in the city of Boise are cost burden, meaning they're spending more than 30% of their income on rent. 30% is a HUD figure, and it's basically stating that anything more than 30% is a problem, and that the notion of a piece of a property being sort of affordable gets much more difficult with that percentage of income being higher and higher, as you'd imagine. And you can see some of the other pieces that we tried to cobble together that really, again, sort of paint a picture and tell a story. 22% of residents are under the age of 18. Demographically speaking, the city of Boise is getting older. If you looked back in time, you would see that that percentage of 22% was higher in the previous decade census of the year 2010. And we expect that this recent census will further bolster that, and our number of under 18 will probably continue to go down, whereas right underneath it, our percentage of older residents, 65 or older, will continue to slowly trickle up. There's a number of factors at play as to why, but just something worth pointing out. The other way we tried to convey information, as I mentioned to you, was by census tract. The city of Boise has approximately 49 census tracts, and so we thought, well, this is another way of demonstrating information. And so we showed by census tract. In this case, for example, 8 of the 49 census tracts have an median income less than 40,000. 16 of the 49 tracts have fewer than 20% with internet access, and so on and so forth. So again, it's just a simple, different way of conveying information. We tried to take information and also display it spatially and geographically through GIS. And the next few images you'll see are what that is and what we tried to put into our report. Starting off with life expectancy. This really struck us when we first saw it. Anybody can look at the numbers on an Excel file, but when you put it into an image such as this, it really does show a pretty stark contrast in specific neighborhoods. And I would point to you, for example, census tract 3.02 up by McAllister neighborhood. Well, right across the road of Hill Road, literally, you see census tract 2.02. where the life expectancy average could vary by as much as 12 years. So that's a pretty stark difference. And imagine, not living your first 12 years of life. Imagine all of the times and memories and that amount of time not being in in your overall lifetime on average. So we thought this was a pretty stark place to begin and begin to tell that story. Population change. This was another one that really stuck out quite a bit when we started to look at information. Why? Well, because the narrative over the last several years has been that the city of Boise is growing, growing, growing. It's out of control growth, right? Everything we hear about is growth, growth, growth. But when you started to look at the information, what you also started to see was that there's census tracts that have actually shrunk in the number of population, and in many cases also the number of households or rooftops. And you can see that demonstrated here. The darker the purple, the either less growth they had or even negative growth with respect to population change. Whereas as you get closer to the browns and yellows, you see that's in fact where the growth has really occurred. As we might have expected, you do see some of those census tracts as you get further toward Meridian, South Boise, maybe the Harris Ranch area, and so forth, where we definitely see the majority of the growth happening. But for the rest of it, anywhere from 3, 6, maybe 10% growth change between the 2000 and the 2017 ACS information that was released at the time we did this project. We tried to also cross-compare information, which is what this image is trying to portray. So what we did with this was we took median household income and we combined it with the rental cost per household. So this basically is demonstrating financial stress. So the lower the median income and the higher the rental cost per household is what you're seeing in this map is showing as where we would describe as tier 1. It's very likely that given where we are with respect to COVID, with respect to our unemployment spike, with the continued increase in housing, that these are the tracts that are probably most likely seeing the biggest strains on monthly income and budgets when it comes to housing and the cost of housing in this particular case. So that's kind of, this really is setting the table of where we expect to see it. Certainly not every story, but at least it kind of shadows a bit of where we might expect some of that. I believe the last one here is economic health and access to transportation. So again, we took percentage of population living below poverty. We took a percentage of households without a car, and then the number of bus stops per 1,000 people per tract, and tried to see, okay, where might we be having transportation issues? Because without viable transportation one way or another, access to the things that we need, whether it be jobs, education, recreation, whatever the case may be, becomes much more of a challenge, and we certainly begin to live a much more isolated life. And so this information is trying to convey that, once again, using the tier 1 through 4 approach. Oh, last one, sorry. This one was the distribution of high density housing. There are definitely different definitions of what density means in the census tract or in the census. What we did was we simply took the number of units at 10 or greater and just called that high density for the sake of using it as in this map to try to demonstrate where is that housing and where is that housing not located. And ultimately you can see that the tiers, the tier 1s that are in purple are the tracts where we see the highest overall number of percentage of high density housing. So census tract 10, for example, and we have the individual tract, of course, we have the individual tract information, but somewhere between 20 and 53% of the housing in that tract would be described as 10 units or greater, whereas say a tract 2411 up kind of near Meridian would have between 0 to 3% of the overall housing stock is going to be 10 units or higher. So clearly that's a neighborhood where single family homes is much more of the dominant offering in that particular case. What did we see thematically? We certainly saw trends, and some of those trends, and this is not an exhausted list, but Housing costs are relocating residents. We kind of know that we're being pushed out. But what we heard and saw time and time again was that many Boise residents that had lived in the city for quite some time were being pushed out of the city, and not necessarily even to Meridian, but as clear away as Nampa and Caldwell. And the old adage of drive till you qualify is definitely true, but we see a western migration of Boise residents being pushed in that general direction, as housing costs were viewed as lower in that particular part of the valley. We know that vouchers that are meant for housing in this particular time are not as effective because our market is so white hot that there's no need to take vouchers, or that the vouchers don't cover enough of the actual rent. So we have some issues there. This third one was pretty troubling, which was we heard from a number of people that tenants of housing are essentially fearful of reporting the specific types of unhealthy issues that they are living in for fear of being evicted. That could mean bug infestations, it could be mold, it could be leaks, it could be a number of things. But ultimately, we heard some pretty rough stories, in particular about kids who are living in places in certain parts of the city where their parents are just afraid to say anything because they just don't, they can't afford to lose their place. And once they are pushed out, then they have to get back in line with respect to first and last month and all of the things that we know happen. Even the application fees has been discussed. All of these things add up, and so there's a genuine fear of retribution on that particular front. We also heard, on a really positive thing, the Boise School District stepping up in a number of ways to provide some real quality elements that sort of align with housing in our neighborhoods, whether it's specifically not just to kids, but also to their parents and or even folks in the neighborhood, but just a number of ways that the Boise School District was really stepping up in some of these more challenged neighborhoods to really make a positive impact for the folks living in and around the schools. Also, other things, what is working? We know that the city's specific efforts have continued to be a positive. We know that there's obviously never enough money and never enough efforts, but of the efforts that have occurred, the folks who have been involved have been incredibly positive about those specifics, and the folks that are, whether they're living there or somehow affiliated with it, there's been a lot of positive statements made about those particular efforts that are not just from the city, but all of the partners as well that come together to make housing happen within our city of Boise. Crime control and prevention, clearly there's a lot of positive activity there. Generally speaking, the police department was generally well reviewed, and crime itself has continued to come down in virtually every case, especially violent crimes. If we go back in time about 10-15 years, we see a continual trend of that, and that's a really good thing, of course. And as I kind of mentioned a minute ago, but school support is also something that's working. Concerns we saw, in addition to some of the trends that you could probably make an argument or concern, a couple things. This is again just an abbreviated list, but there were some folks that felt like the city could do a better job of reaching out, and that was honestly, as the consultant for the city, I was pretty proud that the city heard that and reacted with a positive response and said, we're always trying to be better, and we're always going to be doing our part to be as much as we can outreach, or reaching out to our communities. And I think particularly this event that we're speaking at now is evidence of that. But there's always work to be done. There's always folks that may not hear what they need to hear, and the city acknowledges that and knows that there's always something that can be taken, and action that can be taken to improve those particular communication methods. Family homelessness is a growing concern in our city. We know, a lot of folks sort of assume, I should say, that homelessness tends to be a bit more of single men, That is not necessarily the case. And in fact, some of the leading causes of homelessness, and specifically family homelessness, can be domestic violence, and also can be medical issues and medical bills that add up. In which case, both of those cases can very much lead to an entire family, or even a mother and children finding themselves without a roof over their head. Now, whether they're literally physically experiencing homelessness and have no place whatsoever, or they're living with other people or out of the vehicle or at the shelter, all of which are classified as experiencing homelessness. Needs, as I mentioned, there's a number of needs, but again, this is just sort of the tip of the iceberg. Spectrum-based housing, what in the world is that? That's a term that personally means something to me, and I think we've tried to really, as much as we can, emphasize that this is a term that might be better used than, say, the historic term of affordable housing. What is it getting at? What is it suggesting? It's suggesting that we have two different spectrums in this city. One is an income spectrum, the other one is a housing cost spectrum. And when those two spectrums are aligned, then everybody has the kind of home that they want and can afford. But when those two spectrums are not aligned, and we have two lines that are woefully off base, so to speak, then we have an issue, and that's what we're experiencing now. Our wages are not going up as much as our housing costs are also going up, and so because of that, our spectrum is out of balance, and that's really what this is trying to suggest, is trying to get the types of housing that aligns better with our local incomes per household. Other needs, as I mentioned earlier, city-led housing, I think I touched on that already, but also some of the other things, mental health services. We have, especially as you'd imagine right now, this was done pre-COVID, but now we know mental health is a significant need, and has most definitely been exacerbated given the current outbreak of COVID-19 and what that means for folks and their overall personalities and psychologies, that maybe were already dealing with things in the past, but now it's even unfortunately more challenging. And then our labor shortage. We are not immune to that. The labor shortage has a significant impact on housing, because every single month we are behind the curve, and the hole in the trough of what number of homes we need to be building is continually getting further and further away, because of just the general market for housing of people who want to buy or rent a home here, that live here or want to move here. But this labor shortage is very, very real, and unfortunately very much a cause of why we can't seem to catch up. And again, this isn't just a Boise issue, this is generally across the country as well. Geographically specific findings. As I mentioned to you at the outset, we broke the city up into census tracts, and we further broke them out by tiers 1 through 4. In our report, which is on, I believe, the city's website, and certainly can be made available to anybody that's interested, we took the time to describe each of the tiers, some in greater detail than others. Tiers 1 and 2 we described quite a bit. 3 also, but not quite as much as tier 1 and 3 and 2. And then tier 4 was a general description, as I'll show in a minute. But what we did was, when we found which tiers were of the highest priority, we sent our team out, including myself, and as I mentioned, looked at every single street in each of these particular neighborhoods and examined them, and then talked with a whole bunch of folks who know those areas very well, as much as we possibly could, and as well as tier 2 and tier 3. And what we then did was put that into our document, and again wrote up quite a bit, much more than this. This is just an overview of what each of the several pages sort of covers. But we have a description of the neighborhood. We went into a SWOT analysis, so strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. That's how we organized each of our findings within each of the census tracts. So if you go in and read our report, you'll see 2 to 3 bullet points of strengths, certainly the same for weaknesses, and so forth. It doesn't mean that there aren't more strengths. It doesn't mean that there aren't more opportunities, but those were the ones that really bubbled to the surface when we looked at the data, looked at our team discussions and the interviews that we had, and tried to convey in the report. We also had common metrics, and those metrics, as you see in the lower right, include all of those different categories. As I mentioned, it also, we have all of our metrics that was described earlier, but these are the ones that generally people were most interested in, and specifically had a little bit more to do with maybe the housing than the rest of the environment itself. But these are the common metrics that were on each of the descriptors and pages for all of the different census tracts. Potential projects ideas. We went and examined a number of these different things and tried hard to explore them. Adaptive reuse, that's a term that you hear in the planning world, not used too much outside of the planning or development world, but it's one that we felt is definitely needing to be vetted a lot more. You see much more and more these commercial and retail buildings that are sitting vacant, and this was prior to, again, COVID-19. We have a high expectation that we're only going to see more and more of these buildings sit vacant. Well, unfortunately, there doesn't seem to be much demand to fill those back up with the same types of uses that were there historically. So what do we do with those types of buildings? Is it possible that some of those could be changed in their use and adaptive to maybe be more residential? That's an example. So could we then locate housing in a much more central location, in this case, right in a shopping center along an arterial or collector or what have you, and basically put people where the things that they need might be located already. So that's just something to keep our eye on and explore. But if we don't have our ducks in a row, then we might not even be able to take advantage of that. And there are examples of adaptive reuse that have occurred not just in our region, but throughout the country, some pretty significant projects as well. Mobile home improvements. This is a very difficult one. Mobile home units, because of the ownership situation, with most people who live in a mobile home own the trailer or the mobile home itself, but not the ground underneath, and therefore it becomes very challenging to determine how can they improve their home. And this is also a bit of a difficulty because mobile homes have a general shelf life in terms of when they were constructed and how long they're expected to sort of hold up to the elements. But that is certainly one that needs to be examined and explored further as the next efforts that are underway continue. The zoning changes that are underway right now, we were hopeful and still are very hopeful that this report is just one way that can inform that effort. And it's going on as we speak. And hopefully our findings is one particular piece of information, although quite extensive, that could further help and support how the city is going about making the changes to zoning law that are bringing us up to a more current approach. Broader transportation investment. This is absolutely one that was examined quite a bit, whether it be, in some cases, we found folks who had incredibly close proximity to all of the things that one would need for a high quality of life, but perhaps they were on the other side of a major arterial, and getting to those types of places could be problematic, whether it's maybe a lack of dedicated crossings or in particular intersections or transit access, various ways in which we need to access transportation, and thus the investment that's necessary to bring that about. A couple of other things: tree planting investment, that's underway, as I mentioned, as we speak, but you wouldn't think maybe that trees and housing should necessarily be synonymous, but they certainly are. Trees provide an incredible health benefit. If you don't have a lot of trees, you'll see much higher asthma rates and bronchial issues, for example. So we know that there are parts of Boise where the tree canopy percentage is quite low, and we have corresponding evidence and figures that show our asthma and other health indicators are quite high, unfortunately. So this effort is actually, as we speak, steering to a degree where the city might be looking to invest and plant trees in a much more strategic fashion. And then ultimately also trying to identify this final bullet, which is where are the places that might have a possibility to locate maybe city-led or partner-led housing initiatives throughout our community. And so that might be specifically within certain tracts or certain areas and so forth. But it really is, again, an opportunity to say, hey, there's a piece of property here that this tract needs housing, specifically this kind of housing. Maybe this is the place that the city examined further in the subsequent years as we go forward. And I kind of touched on this a second ago, but growing mental health services, that's a bit of a challenge for the city, since the city really doesn't, this isn't something that the city really does much of. We have partners through Central District Health, certainly through the different healthcare providers and private clinicians and so forth that really, this is their bailiwick, but how can the city further support their efforts, because it's definitely needed. Next steps. Where we are with respect to the next steps, this is just an overview, and I'm not going to touch on this too much, but we've started to at least set the table for where we are now, which is looking at barriers to housing, access to housing. We found some things and ultimately are using this as a guide of saying, okay, here are strategies that are listed particularly on the left-hand side of this graphic, and this graphic, all these. And then who are our partners and what can be done, who can help out in some of these different strategies. I'm not going to belabor this too much because that's kind of where we are now, which is, again, kind of with respect to the impediments to housing and the 5-year action plan that is coming from it, which is what this slide really just sums up. So again, the initial effort was intended to set the foundation, to give the city direction, and really allow not only the community development department, but many of the other departments within the city to start taking actions now rather than waiting. But in the meantime, as all of those different planning or different entities within the city are taking actions, we're in the midst of developing these two documents now, which again is the impediments document and the 5-year consolidated plan. And ultimately, all this stuff is going to fuel the annual action plan. All of these are required by HUD, by the way, but give the city a pretty significant direction of where to go over the next decade when it comes to housing and all of the different elements that support housing, support a healthy neighborhood, and ultimately try to fulfill what has been an elusive goal, which is feeling quality of life, right? What does quality of life mean? And I think we've hit on a number of different issues and ways we can define that in this discussion. And that's exactly what the city recognizes and is working hard to try and improve. So with that, I'm going to stop share. Well, I guess I'll stop share now. And if there are questions that I need to go back into the presentation with, I will certainly do that. I don't know if this is going to be moderated or if it's all up to me to answer questions. I do know that there is one question that was asked via the app, and that the question was, how can neighborhoods work to identify food deserts, and what agencies could they reach out to solve it? It's a great question, and food deserts is, first of all, there's a definition of food deserts that needs to be understood, and that comes from the FDA. In urban environments, I believe it's a half mile, which actually for probably most people in this city, living within a grocery store half mile might not always be the case. So there's quite a few food deserts by definition. Practically speaking, certainly for some folks, that's much more extreme than others. How do we solve that issue? Well, there's only so many grocery stores, full-fledged grocery stores, that are going to be built in the city of Boise, and we know that those are only built every several years. It's not like they're being built all the time. So I don't personally believe, I do believe that obviously having the foresight and the zoning in place, and actively engaging those particular companies that are our major grocers, certainly that's a strategy that needs to continue, but it's not the end all be all. I will throw a bit of a curveball, however, at folks, and recognize that, and this kind of also comes from, again, when I was on our P&Z, is that the days of the old style neighborhood market, which we know in the city of Boise, we have, what is it? Is it M&W? I think it is, on Warm Springs. We know the Jefferson Market, 27th Street, some of those older markets. Well, if you look at the square footage of those markets, they were actually fewer, in some cases, of 1,500 feet, maybe 2,000 at most. If you look at our modern gas station markets that are being built all over the place, those markets are now on the magnitude of 3,000 to 4,000 square feet. So they can easily be twice the size of the markets of sort of yesteryear. The question then becomes, what do we need to sell in those markets? And that becomes very tricky, right? Because clearly that's a private operation, and they are generally selling what they believe is going to be sold and sell a lot of. And it's not always the healthiest options, although they are getting better in some cases. So to me, that is a very important strategy on this access to food. If you know Garden City, you can see this being played out every single day at Chinden, and I think it's 38th Street, where you see folks who live on the south side of Chinden. There is not a grocery store anywhere near them. The nearest grocery store is likely the Fred Meyer clear on Glenwood. But there is, in this case, a Chevron Market on the other side, on the north side of Chinden, and folks are crossing at that intersection all day long to get various items from the gas station market across the street. So that is a very real 21st century food access issue, and has taken the place of the older style community neighborhood that a lot of us have a lot of fond memories and want to see more of. But it's a difference in our approach and so forth. But I would absolutely say that city being proactive about those places, getting in front of it, working with the health district to try to figure out what can be sold that does offer some good nutritious value and so forth, is the strategy that I would most likely try to employ, as well as even getting ahead of it and identifying where some of those could be needed most. So a bit of a curveball answer maybe, but that's where I would go with that. I'm not seeing the questions. Chat box. Any questions in the chat box? No, I don't see any questions in the chat box. So, not sure where to go with this. I guess I think we're pretty much done. I don't have anything else to talk about. And if there are no more questions, I don't know what other avenues people may be asking questions. That this is all I have. I guess then I will leave it at this. My contact information for anybody who's watching who might have an additional question later on. Vitruvian Planning here in Boise. You can find our website. You can find certainly my phone number, and the city has it as well. I'm always open to ask or answer any questions that anybody might have, and look forward to any of that might occur after this. So with that, hearing nothing else, I appreciate the opportunity and thank you for attending.